All right. Hey guys, welcome to the Built Lean podcast. I'm Mark Perry, the creator of Built Lean, which helps busy men with demanding careers get lean, strong, and functionally fit with exceptional vitality, right? And so today I have a very special guest with me, Dr. Kathy Dooley, who is a world-renowned rehabilitative chiropractor with a very deep knowledge of anatomy. In fact, she's an adjunct anatomy professor at 2 New York City medical schools, and she has many teaching pursuits and several certifications, including active release technique, NeuroKinetic Therapy, and StrongFirst SFG, just to name a few. And she is co-owner of Catalyst Sport in New York City, where she sees patients. And in 2014, I came across Kathy because I wanted to properly rehabilitate my body, and I'd still had some challenges I was working through from low back surgery many years prior. And I was preparing for the StrongFirst Kettlebell certification. And I came to think of Kathy as kind of my personal body mechanic. And I've worked with a lot of rehabilitative therapists over the years. And I'm telling you, Kathy is world class. And she's a teacher to the teachers. And she practices what she preaches. She is strong and she is fit, for sure. So with that said, thank you, Kathy, for joining me today. I really appreciate it.
Wow, that is such a great intro. I'm so honored that you chose me to help you with your healthcare. And it's always so great to see someone excel with the kettlebell like you have, and also use the kettlebell not just for strength, but in leanness, which of course you are the king of, but also to help you protect your back, which
Absolutely.
is so great.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And I really appreciate that. And so I guess starting off, I'd love to hear more about how did you become interested in becoming a rehabilitative chiropractor?
Oh, it's so great. I was one of those people that didn't respond very well to traditional chiropractic, and I was in chiropractic school, and I gravitated to chiropractic school because it did help me solve a really bad neck problem that I had. And I was like, oh, wow, I really want to do that as my job. And so I worked for a chiropractor for a while, and then she wrote my letter of recommendation to get into school. But when I was there, I was noticing it didn't solve problems that I had. Like I would get adjusted or massaged and things like that. And my problems kept coming back. And I was introduced to rehabilitative chiropractic by a colleague. It was my first semester in school. I got really lucky. And I noticed that the more stable I got, the less I had to stretch. And the more strong I got, the more stable I stayed. And so I was like, wait a minute, is this a whole field of rehab? What can I want to do this. And so for very flexible people like myself, we don't really respond to chiropractic as well as people that have mobility problems, and we have more stability, motor control problems. And that's where our tightness comes from. So no amount of stretching solves it. No amount of adjusting solves it, because we don't know how to put ourselves in the right place. And I liken it to like when you put a parking brake on a car, you do it to tighten things up to create safety. And so I wanted to learn more about how to take the parking brakes off for people. And I had to put the lens on myself first. I had to learn how to authentically help myself first before I was going to be any use to anybody else. And so that's where it started.
Cool. And so I was hoping to dive into a little bit of the exercise stuff right here. And so, at Catalyst Sport, your utmost principle is never rob trunk stability to gain fitness. Uh-huh. And so what does that mean, and why is it the utmost principle?
Yeah, it's a borrowed thought from the amazing Greg Cook, the physical therapist that started selective functional movement assessment and functional movement systems. And we base everything on that at Catalyst. So it's basically a way to manage if someone has problems through stability motor control. And a lot of times people will try to rob from their trunk, their lumbar spine area as well, to try to gain mobility in their hips. And the irony is that the thing that controls the hips, knees, feet is coming from the lower lumbar spine. So if you destabilize that area by creating discogenic changes, by creating pathologies of the lumbar spine, you actually threaten the strategies of the lower extremity. It's sort of like stepping on a gardening hose that's trying to water a garden. You take the foot off the hose and then you can water the garden. And that's what trunk stability is like, being able to create a rigidity around the lumbar spine to prevent its damage, so that the nerves that are going from the lumbar spine down to the limbs are not impeded upon. And when I started to apply this to myself and to all of my patients, it resulted in the treatments lasting longer. I'm sure you could share with the group. You didn't have to see me 3 times a week for 6 weeks. I mean, that would have been nice because you're awesome, but it wasn't necessary. I think it's not necessary.
Okay, and so you were talking about a couple ideas for improving, trunk stability and essentially your spine stability. I mean, what would you do, or like how would you do that?
Sure. So our lumbar spine, basically below the ribs and above your pelvis, right? Those vertebrae, they tend towards being bent towards the front, right? There's a natural curve that you've earned in your low back, and it's called a lordosis. And your not so earned curve, if you will, is up between your shoulder blades and then down at your tailbone area. Mm-hmm. And so those areas, they require the support built from the neck and through the lumbar spine, particularly the lumbar spine. And it creates a coil. If you think about like your mattress doesn't have a pole underneath it, a stick, it tends to have coils because that takes more compressive loads and you can create buoyancy and disperse any pressure on it like a smart spring in biomechanics, right? And if you are able to support the lumbar spine by creating what we call neutral spine, which would be a more curved low back and a less curved mid back and tailbone area, then what you do is you create the coils. And the way that we do that is I personally like to use things that I used when I was a kid to do that. And babies create those curves in their necks, create those curves in their backs, right? How do they do that? Well, they do that by certain neurodevelopmental progression positions. And Mark, you probably remember I put you through a lot of this.
I see it behind you, by the way, on the wall.
You do
on the wall.
Yes.
There it is.
So you see it a little better now.
Yeah. Sorry.
So I was very much inspired by DNS, dynamic neuromuscular stabilization techniques, and it was all about watching neural development of the child and how they build what we call it at my seminar series. We call it load share, where you're able to share loads across the spine, where it doesn't hit one particular spot. So many people have lumbar spine problems. So why is that? It's because they're bending only at one spot and they're not able to distribute force well through the spine. So I thought, like, what's the best way to be able to distribute force? Watch a kid. They know how to distribute force, or they're going to face plant because their heads are a fourth of their body weight. So the adult has a different proportion. So we don't want to move like a baby. What we want to do is we want to stabilize like a baby. And when people give me flack about trying to use neurodevelopmental positions in the adult, they don't realize the mistake they're making, that if you watch a child, they distribute force well. And that's what we're trying to emulate is equal force distribution. So I'll put people on their bellies and on their backs and teach them how to maintain their spinal curves and then start to move their limbs. They'll breathe first because breathing helps to protect the lumbar spine. Many peer-reviewed literature studies support that. And then you start to move and ambulate through the arms and legs, and you do it on a stable platform so that you're not threatening the lumbar spine. And it turns out that frees up movement, but without sacrificing the stability of the trunk.
So I think this is a great segue into breathing. And so I think, when I saw you, it was in March 2014. I had my assessment, and we focused a lot on breathing. And it was like
Yes.
I was unable to breathe, I guess, into my lower back and into the sides. And I think, can you talk a little bit more about why breathing is so important? And you actually said, I just want to kind of just reiterate for everyone here who's listening, breathing must be the primary focus of all corrective and performance exercises. I think you said that at some point. So anyways, can you talk a little bit more about what is the deal with breathing? Why is it so important?
It's my favorite topic.
Okay.
Especially since we're in the middle of a respiratory pandemic, right? It's breathing. Breathing's really crucial. What breathing does, what McGill's studies have shown, and Stu McGill's this amazing spinal researcher, what he found was that by the building and release of intra-abdominal pressure, that's what happens when you breathe, right? When you breathe in, you build pressure in your gut. And the diaphragm, the major breathing muscle, drops down when you breathe in. And if you imagine, that decreases the pressure in your thorax around your heart rate, and it allows the lungs to fill with air like a vacuum. So just like when you turn on a vacuum, that same thing happens every time you inhale. It's a neat way to think about it. So as you increase pressure in your belly, you actually create a pneumatic pressurized system that protects the lumbar spine from moving. Because the truth in life is that if you want to gain mobility, you have to sacrifice stability, right? And so the lower lumbar spine has the most amount of important nerves coming from it, but has the least amount of structural stability. And so we have to stabilize it with things like breath. And your air pressure system, if it's equally shared in load across the trunk, can be very good at helping your low back. What we found in you, even post-surgically, was that you never really had that. You never had the ability to breathe into the sides of the ribs, which is biomechanical breathing, and then to breathe into the posterolateral side, the back edges of the sides of the ribs. And that was preventing you from not only exhibiting your maximum strength, but by stabilizing your back, it was going to free up your hip movement to allow you to do fun things like sprint and without groin pain, swing a kettlebell without back pain. It allows you to stabilize your center so that you can free up the mobility of the legs.
And can you talk a little bit about belly breathing versus chest breathing?
Yeah, like remember that the chest is it's a pump handle movement, which basically means the chest comes out in front when you inhale. And that's a passive movement. It requires no muscular activity to push that stuff up. Because if you breathe into the lower sides of your ribs, what's happening is the diaphragm drops down and it creates a negative pressure in the chest. So if you breathe into your chest as an initial type of breath, which we call paradoxical breathing or dysfunctional breathing, what you end up doing is you don't build that diaphragmatic pressure down. You don't build the same intra-abdominal pressure, and you start to increase pressures into the lumbar spine. And now you just threw off the spring. Now you kinked the slinky, if you will. And now you can't distribute force through the limbs as well. And also, you can't exchange oxygen as well. They've shown that chest breathers have more poor oxygenation of the blood than belly breathers.
And so, by the way, in terms of chest breathing versus belly breathing, just something I've noticed is like you go into stress mode or kind of fight or flight mode when you're breathing into your chest. But most people, maybe I'm wrong. I mean, you could tell me. It seems like most people, at least assessments I've done, breathing into the chest. It's like do a quick, like, okay, just breathe in. It's like like the chest goes up, right?
Yes,
and so
I think that we live in a stressful world. I think that we the thing that babies have on us in a huge way is that they are precognitive. They don't have a choice. They only do it the right way. And as we have this free will and cognition, we can choose to not go back to what we built in the first place. And I have to return to it all the time. Like I'll feel myself like take a chest breath and I'm like, ah! And then you develop that conscious incompetence. You catch yourself doing it poorly. And that's the only real way to build the competence in the pattern. So it's okay to fail at it, but you have to know that you're failing. And so a lot of my patients don't know they're failing until I teach them how to catch themselves. And then you can reprogram what you've built as a stress response, because you can train your body when it's stressed to breathe better. But if you let it go, run amok, if you will, you're basically breathing on autopilot. So you'll breathe in the way that you've trained yourself to respond. And some of our trained responses don't work well for us.
Right. And so we're also talking, the one thing I also hope you can talk a little bit about is mouth versus nasal breathing. And so one thing, like when we were working together that made a big shift for me and that helped me open up was like, I went from kind of chest breathing and kind of lifting up to just opening up my belly, and like my abs, like musculature was constricted. Like it wasn't happening, and it took time to open up. And eventually I was able to kind of breathe through the nose into the belly, and it just like opened up my body over time. And I'm kind of curious if you can talk a little bit more about like nasal breathing versus mouth breathing.
Yes. I'm actually giving a lecture on that later tonight. So it's perfect timing. So mouth breathing on the inhale, especially. And the exhale, I'm not as strict with as I am on the inhale. And I'll explain why in a second. So when you inhale, you can either inhale through your nasal cavity or inhale through your oral cavity. The nasal cavity actually has a lot of filtering through hairs, which we all find kind of unpleasant when they're growing, but they actually serve a really good purpose of filtration. And then there's mucosa, this connective tissue that actually prevents bacterial infiltrates. So it'll catch things as it comes in. It also moistens the air, filters it, basically making sure that the air is clean. And then also in your nose, you have these things called nitric oxide receptors. Nitric oxide receptors are a part of the immune response, the inflammatory cascade. Basically, they're vasodilators, bronchodilators. So when you breathe in, you activate these nitric oxide receptors and send a signal to open up the bronchioles, the airway. And you also try to open up your blood vessels, and it helps you to slow the blood pressure and helps you to get an even flow of blood to the sites, which is really important for distal extremities because they get the last hit, right? And so you don't have as much of that in your mouth, right? We don't have as much hair. We don't have as much of the mucosa that really can help to stop and filter the air. It's a bigger space. There's less total ability to filtrate. We don't have these conch shells in our mouth, but we have them in our nose that help us make the air turbulent so we can clean it. And because of that, on the inhale, I want all of my patients, whether they're deadlifting 500 or they're just doing quiet breathing, I want all the inhales to be nasal so they can filter, so they can activate nitric oxide, so they can open up their lungs better, so they go into less stress responding, so they can, basically get more blood everywhere they need to go. It actually helps to lower blood pressure too. And then if you mouth breathe, a couple of things happen if you inhale on mouth breathing. There's this big muscle in your tongue that actually will constrict your airway if your mouth is open on inhalation. So basically, if you breathe with your mouth open on the inhale, you make your airway smaller. That's not good. Whereas nasal breathing opens the airway, mouth breathing narrows the airway. So you're going to get less total air in. They've shown in studies that you actually up to 10% more oxygenation inhaling through the nose rather than inhaling through the mouth. And if you're messing around with your oxygen, I don't know, like the odds are pretty good you want as much oxygen as possible, particularly when you're training. So a good idea would be to make all your inhales through the nose.
Okay, interesting.
Yeah.
And I remember you at least recommending at the time, you could even go for a jog and breathe through your nose. Is that something you still talk about?
Oh yeah, I'm really passionate about it. My rule is all the inhales need to be through the nose, but as far as the exhales go, if it means you're going to lose your belly breathing and you're going to start inhaling and exhaling through the nose and you're going to start to do paradoxical breathing, I would prefer you to exhale through your mouth to build that gut tension.
Right.
If that's what, and Navy SEALs do this, powerlifters do this. You'll see them like puff out their cheeks when they exhale, and they exhale through their mouth so they can create a sphincter, and they slow the exhale so they don't pass out, right? So I think that you can do functional exhalation through the mouth or through the nose, but if the demand is too high, a lot of people can't like lift the 500 and let out pressure through the nose unless they've really trained it. So yes, you can do everything through the nose, but if you can't currently do everything through the nose, at least do it on the inhale.
Okay. And so let's talk a little about pain and injury in general. One thing you've talked about regarding kind of chronic pain, and certainly most of the people I would say who are listening have had chronic pain, right? Most of us have had it at some point. And you talk about you must build a new pathway, remodel and rebuild. Like, what do you mean by that?
Yeah, so if somebody has pain past 1 year, they've now entered a brain remodeling at the back of your brain. It's called the parietal lobe, where it's receiving all these pain signals. You actually create what I call a German Autobahn, like no stops. The speeding is not even matched, right? You basically create a pathway to experience pain or nociception without an injurious process necessarily even being present. And this is a hard sell, to be able to tell my patients, nothing's actually wrong with you, and it's just a highway you keep going down. And then they're like, how is that possible, that pain is not injury? And I'm like, actually, they're completely separate entities. And I tell them, like, some injuries aren't even painful. Like, I have patients that like completely rupture a ligament and feel no pain. They just feel instability. And then I'll have patients that do a grade 1 sprain of a ligament and feel enormous discomfort. because of an inflammatory cascade. So pain and injury are not the same. And if you have pain past a year and it's chronic, you have created a pathway that you have to now remodel, which means you have to dig a dirt highway to follow next to the German Autobahn, which takes effort, it takes failure, it takes rebuilding, and it takes time. And some people are really impatient with pain because it's so uncomfortable. It's noxious reception, nociception. So people will take pain pills or muscle relaxants. So they'll do all kinds of different therapies to try to kill pain. And a part of that process has to be remodeling. If you don't remodel the way the brain perceives the discomfort, then you're always just trying to ameliorate pain instead of actually preventing the reception.
So what are some ways to, like, can you give an example of like what remodeling is?
Absolutely. So if someone comes to me with a hip pain, right, and they've had chronic hip pain for a year, they may have a perceived threat of getting in certain positions. Like one position you probably always saw me in was kneeling, right? I've had a hip problem, so I'm always going to kneel because I know it centers my hip and prevents pain, right? It builds a new pathway. But if I sit too long, like in a car, I might feel my pain again because I went down the old highway. And so what I teach people to do is choose new things. If they have an exacerbatory position, like something makes them worse, like sitting, then sitting a different way. Or choosing a different neural drive for something. Like if they squat, but it's too painful on their back, maybe back squatting isn't right for them. Maybe they need to front squat. And so just those little tiny changes can actually remodel and change the way that they perceive their environment, which can result in less discomfort.
Interesting. All right. And so let's talk a little bit about like, some kind of practical exercises, right? So, a lot of guys who are listening, I think we just want to create some like kind of practical, like, okay, this is something you can take away. And so one question I had was, what are some of your like top few exercises to help someone kind of, I guess, rehabilitate or just get stronger and improve
Absolutely.
their body?
Oh, I'm happy to send you links to these too.
Okay, cool.
So they're all on my YouTube, and it's completely free, guys. It's not monetized. I want you guys to just enjoy it. One of the most important drills, I think, for building like a full body stability and strength would always start with breathing, obviously. So it's a drill called supine 90-90. So you would start on your back with your legs in the air. And of course, I'll send you a video of doing that properly. Then I would roll them over to their elbow and start them through the phases of the get up. And the get up is how we get ourselves out of bed. It's how we actually trained ourselves to walk before we could walk. And it's a full body strategizing of getting off the floor and standing up. And it involves rolling over to an elbow, propping oneself onto an elbow, sweeping a leg underneath them to go into a kneeling position, and then going from kneeling to standing. And then you reverse it, and then you would start adding load to it. And that is one of the best exercises on the planet. The third exercise I would give that's inside of the get up is practicing lunging as much as possible, whether it's for your work, if you're on the computer, or if you are just trying to take a knee when you're trying to observe something. I practice 8 or 9 hours a day in kneeling. And it's really important because it protects the back, it protects all of your movement subsystems to help everything hold together nicely. And babies do this at 11 months. It actually is quite challenging. People are in love with the squat and they're in love with deadlifting, which I love those things, but I love lunging way more. I think lunging builds full body stability, mobility, and strength better than any exercise on the planet. And it's built in the get up. So you can either practice more get ups or you could do lunging separately. The last two things I would suggest would be swinging and snatching. So swinging a kettlebell, it means for us, like the Russian kettlebell for Mark and I, would be ending the kettlebell swing where it lines up with your chest. And I like that in case somebody has a shoulder problem. The thing that's the best in the world is the snatch. But as Mark will tell you, it takes an evolution of understanding how to do that well. Yes. And if you have a thread of that, I have a video I can show you on how you can, train yourself to do these things called high pulls, which prepare you for snatching, which I'm sure Mark has endured. The swing and the snatch, the reason I like them is they build VO2 max and they build that cardiovascular capacity, but while also building strength. Like a lot of people want to get lean, right? They want to be fit, they want to be healthy. And I think a swing or a snatch, whatever they can do appropriately, or a mixture of both, they build that cardiovascular capacity. They burn body fat. They keep you very lean, but also make you very strong. And there's just not a lot of cardio that also makes you strong at the same time, unless you're doing everything perfectly. And I think running is really challenging to do that way. Elliptical doesn't really build bone density. There's things that are missing. I don't think anything's missing from the swing or the snatch. And if you're really trying to improve your breathing, trying to improve your energy levels, and if you want to incinerate body fat, then the swing and the snatch are two fantastic choices. So those would be my big ones, like starting with a breathing practice, moving it to the get up from the breathing practice, really getting good at lunging for full body power.
And you mean like sideways, forward, backwards?
Oh yeah, okay. Every direction.
Right. Okay.
And turning that into step up, step downs, which are forms of lunging. Yeah. And then a swing or snatch or a combination of both.
Okay, that's awesome. And one of the things that I think also had a huge impact on what we worked on was just some of your lifestyle tips. Like you're talking about like kneeling, for example. I actually saw you half kneeling and working on a computer, and I'm just like,
oh yeah,
this is interesting. And I used to sit down and work on a computer, and that's kind of how. And then I wonder like why I'm just unable to like improve my shoulder mobility, and I'm always rounded. It's like you're kind of pulling a rubber band, and it just goes back in place.
I love that you said that, Mark, because a lot of people don't equate shoulder mobility with their hips, and that's a big mistake. And I'm glad that you didn't make it. Like when you kneel, what happens with the baby is that at 11 months they kneel, right? And they're trying to push themselves up. And when they can get 100 degrees of humeral flexion, which is what most people want, they want to be able to reach their arms overhead. Once they can do that, they stand up, which means that your arm is connected to your hip via these obliques. It's a really important connection. So if you want to build really good shoulder mobility, one of the things I have people do is kneel and teach them how to push themselves up. And you wouldn't believe how hard it is for them. It's so challenging.
Interesting. And so regarding, some of the lifestyle stuff, for example, I guess we'll start with like a general question and then kind of dive in from there. So like what lifestyle tips would you give to help guys who work on a computer a lot, who feel pretty stiff, like improve their health and well-being?
One of the best tips, I have two big tips. One is kneel as often as possible, right? That's an obvious statement. So working and kneeling, I can send you a video of me coaching through that if you want, for your community. The next one is get your elbows on something. The best thing you can do is remember who you were as a kid when you were pushing away from your elbows. And so most people, their elbows are hanging off of their desk and they're not on their armrests and they're like hanging in the air. And I think that's a big problem. I want their elbows on something so they can physically push away from their elbows. And that's one of the ways to keep your posture upright. The baby uses their elbows like crazy, but the adults barely ever do. Like we're taught to keep our elbows off the table, which is an epic mistake.
Interesting.
We should have our elbows on the table all the time. So when I'm in a restaurant, I have my elbows on the table and I push.
Oh.
Yeah. So break those etiquette rules, please, like for your own safety.
Interesting. And any thoughts on standing desk? Because I know you're doing half. And by the way, when we're talking kneeling, we're talking half kneeling, which is pretty cool. Like I don't think a lot of people who are listening have heard that. So I just wanted to be curious. Yeah, you can send me a video and I'll share.
Because I don't want to, waste the whole time talking about kneeling, although I could talk about kneeling for like 50
I'm
hours.
sure you could.
So I'll send you guys the video. Like
standing or half kneeling. Yeah, like standing or half
kneeling on one knee or kneeling on two knees. Any kind of kneeling I'll take, but I really like it on one knee, like a half kneeling.
Okay.
And then getting my elbows on something. So those two things together are magical.
And any opinion on standing desk or no?
They're not my favorite.
Why?
The reason why is that standing is still creating a problem for a lot of people where they'll like shift to one leg, shift to the other leg, hyperextend their back, still slouch. I think it solves part of the slouching issue, but you still can't get your elbows on something. Unless you have your elbows on something, you're still not supporting the neck. So the neck starts looking at the computer. And I feel like I see a lot of people that the standing desk helped maybe with their back, but now they're feeling their hip or their knee or their neck. And I'm like, okay, it's like robbing Peter to pay Paul instead of just paying both Peter and Paul. So I do think the kneeling chairs, by the way, are a good substitute for a chair. But I don't think standing's bad. It just wouldn't be my it's not something I do. It wouldn't be my first choice. But if you like it, if you get something out of it, by all means do it. So maybe you do a mixture of that. Maybe you do a little bit of standing desk, and maybe you do a little bit of tall kneeling, and maybe you do a little bit of sitting, and maybe the solution is doing a little bit of everything.
Okay. And do you have any thoughts on footwear? Because I know that at Catalyst, it's barefoot training, and I think you wore Vibrams a little bit. So yeah, any thoughts on footwear?
Yeah, I personally can't wear anything like a Vibram 5-finger because it spreads my great toe away from the second toe too much. Okay. And I have a condition where that already happens too much. So I can't wear those. But I wear Merrell Vapor gloves like everywhere. And then I wear a very, very flexible boot made by Boggs for the winter. And it's hard to get me out of either of those shoes. The only time I did was when I got married. I wore a heel for like 15 minutes and I was out of it. I've had too many problems. So for your community, like the dress shoes become a challenge, right? Because they have that little bit of a lift and they are also very narrow in the forefoot. So I have a lot of gentlemen come to me with, problems in their feet and ankles and knees because the shoe's not flatter. But luckily for you guys, there's some pretty industrious people out there that have created minimalist dress shoes. And you can, start with those, or maybe just training without having shoes on. The reason why is because there's 10,000 sensory receptors on the bottom of your foot. And if you have a shoe on with a big thick sole, like an ASIC or a Saucony, nothing against those companies. It's just like, I can't feel anything. And if I want my body to react and my hips, knees, all of it are wired to my feet, then I want to feel my feet. And some of my patients are so uncomfortable when they first do this that it'll almost talk them out of it, but just because they're never barefoot. And then, as you start to build up the stability and density of the foot, you wake up those intrinsic muscles of the foot, which you have over 20 of them in the bottom of your foot. Then what happens is you start to have better spatial awareness, better cueing into the hips, better stability for your back because the hips help stabilize the back. And then you end up not going back, which I won't go back to wearing a heel.
Interesting. Okay.
Yeah.
And
I'm a huge advocate.
Okay. And any thoughts on, because one of the things we even talked about was like a pillow and like, mattress, and like any thoughts on kind of what pillow you recommend using or a mattress, should it be stiffer? What are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, I think the stiffest that you could do, it should be stiff like a massage table stiff. Like, I really like a stiff mattress. Like, we had to design ours. It got really, we got the stiffest mattress we could buy, and then we had to put a piece of plywood between it and the box spring, and then we had to put, one of the far infrared pads on it to make it stiff enough for me to be okay with it. I don't think they make mattresses stiff enough at all, and I think it causes a lot of back problems. The back wants a hard surface, and that takes some getting used to. But when people have acute back injuries, they always talk about laying on the floor, that the bed makes it worse.
I think that's really, it's really interesting. I think it's interesting because it's just different from what I think many people hear because it's a lot of marketing, right? So what about the pillow? Any thoughts on the size of the pillow, using no pillow? No pillow?
I have opinions. I'm going to send you a video I made on this too. So you guys will have lots of support videos in case you're interested in this. But if you're laying on your side, you need to have support that leaves your nose in line with your breastbone. So if you're on your side, you don't want your head hanging and tilting to either side. If you're on your back, no pillow.
Right.
And if you're on your belly, you need to have a body pillow between your arm and your leg so that your head doesn't crank. So again, the nose needs to be in line with the breastbone. So if you're on your belly, on your side, nose in line with breastbone, any pillow that you have that can create that. And then honestly, some people like Tempur-Pedic. I don't like Tempur-Pedic because when I flip over onto my back, then my head is cranked up, and so it's not for me. But really, you have to figure this out for yourself and figure out what works for you. I use the SleepGram. I really like that because you can change the pillow to have more density on one end than the other. So my pillow is very flat on the left side so that when I lay on my back, there's no support. And then when I roll to my side, it has more pillow so that it neutralizes my neck. And that has helped so much. So the SleepGram has 3 inserts inside of it. It's pretty cheap. I think it's like $60, and it's magical.
Interesting. All right, I'll look into that. And then regarding, and I know we're coming up on time here. You probably have patients you need to see. Yeah. Regarding, I think one of the kind of tips you've given in terms of okay, What's like a practical tip for someone who's, sitting down at a computer most of the day? It's like, how does someone like that, improve their mobility and just kind of, build it into that lifestyle? And I think one thing you mentioned was potentially like put a pull-up bar in your like living room or your office and just hang from it. Like, you talk a little bit more about that?
Absolutely. If I could put a pull-up bar in every office in all the world, I wish that I would just hit the lottery. So that's the first thing I would do. I would just send out pull-up bars to everyone because they're really cheap and they're easy to install. And when you see it, you get that cue to go hang from it. And let's face it, we're primates. We're supposed to be hanging from stuff. And I'm not so sure that our bodies are designed to sit behind a computer all day. So if you can break up that tension by go hang from something, it can really, really help. I've already hung like 3 times today. It's really, really, really helpful. The second thing is, changing your positions often when you're working. Most people stay too fixed at one position. It's usually seated or standing. So sit a little, stand a little. Sitting's not bad. It's just not good to do all the time. So sit a little, stand a little, kneel a lot, or use a kneeling chair where you're being forced to kind of posture up a little bit. But I think it was Stu McGill who said the best position is the one you're not in longer than 15 minutes. I really love that. I think you should be more fidgety and start to change your work environment. We fixate our work environment, and that benefits no one. Like, you should be moving more throughout your day. Why is your desk always in the same place? They ever thought about it? It's just for convenience for who? It's not for your body. Maybe for your mind, I guess. But I don't know. I feel like you should change positions a lot. It improves circulation. The more you stay in one spot, you're impeding circulation of something. So circulation is my major focus in my patients. I want blood moving. I want lymphatics moving. I want their bodies moving. So if I wanted to improve mobility, I'd improve circulation, right? And so just change your position as often as possible.
Cool. Well, let's end on that. And so how can people learn more about you? How can they find you?
Oh, yeah. So I'll send you guys, I'll send Mark some of the videos we talked about. And so that's all on my YouTube. If you guys want to go on YouTube, it's Dr. Dooley Noted, DrDooleyNoted. And I'm happy to send you a link to that. And I'll give you my personal email. If you have questions, feel free to write. They always say if you want something done, give it to a busy person. So I return emails within 24 hours typically. Cool. If I'm delayed, I'll let you know. But I'd love to answer your questions. I think it's great what you folks are doing, tuning in to Mark's podcast to learn more about how to help yourself. I am a huge advocate of doctor meaning teacher, not fix your stuff. So I've been very proud to be in Mark's healing team to help inspire and catalyze him helping himself. And I hope that you guys will do the same.
Awesome. Well, listen, Kathy, it was awesome catching up, and enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you, Mark. Bye.
All right. Bye-bye.